Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon to those in parts of the world that I'm not in. Just, I don't know all of you, so just so I have a better idea of who's in this year. First of all, before I even ask who you are, is everyone that was here? I know that Chaim was here last week, but and I believe Ms. Levin was here last week. But I don't Alan, I know you weren't here. But Alan, Rachi, were you able to check the archives? I'm not asking to, to pry into your information. I just need to know because this year is somewhat of a continuation of last week. Okay. Okay. Anyways, one more question. Of course, Alan Goldenberg is from the sunny city of Chicago, but Ms. Hain and Ms. Levin, where are you from exactly? In the meantime, I'll tell you, I wrote in the chat a few minutes ago, or I copied and pasted into the chat, a link to a Wikipedia page, which generally Wikipedia is pretty decent for even information about personalities in the Torah, and this one happens to be relatively good compared to other Wikipedia entries. It's about the Vilna Gaon, and the reason why I posted this one specifically is today we'll be spending the majority of our time. Our share won't go the full hour, but it'll go most of the hour, and we'll be spending most of the time on an answer given by the Gaon from Vilna, also known as the Gra. So I'll make introduction to the Gra a little bit later on when we reach the part that I'd like to look at. But it's a good idea. I didn't hear from Ms. Hain or Ms. Levin. Can you just maybe write in the chat where you're from so I have an idea where the audience is from this evening? It's actually sleeting in where I live in Eretz Yisrael, which is, first of all, it's rare for Eretz Yisrael in general. I live in a colder region of Israel, so like we get this like twice every 3 years, so it's sort of nice. But if for some reason my technology fails us, you can blame it on Eretz Yisrael that the snow took us out. Does anyone hear me? Because I'm not getting in the chats, but I guess I'll begin anyway. So last week, okay. Mr. Goldenberg, Alan hears me. Thank you. So uses a Mac, so therefore it always works well. Okay. Maui, Hawaii, where it is morning now. Okay. Well, aloha to Hawaii. Shalom from Eretz Yisrael. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to my lovely wife who gave me tea. All right, so last week we began a discussion that, broadly speaking, dealt with a question that is more, we dealt with it last week more in a halachic direction than we would in terms of philosophical and what it means possibly to this year. We dealt with the question of who authored the last 8 psukim of the Torah. This is not a discussion that I made up. This is not a discussion that is even so greatly argued upon, meaning that there's not that much written on it. But the important aspect of this discussion is twofold. One is that we were able to, and this is what we did last week in Shir, trace how a philosophical question, or it's not even philosophical, a historical question like that the one we're dealing with, ultimately affected halacha, and how it changed, and how different rabbanim who are responsible for both the Torah She-Baal Peh and commentaries on the Torah She-Baal Peh, how they took this historical question and applied it to everyday Judaism and specific Jewish law. So last week we covered the question on a halachic level of whether or not Moshe or Yehoshua authored the last 8 psukim of the Torah, how it affected halacha. Just to quickly review, and we'll see it again in the Vilna Gaon's answer to this. The Gemara asks the same question in 2 different places, and also the Medrash talks about it. And the 2 basic ideas are that either Moshe wrote the last 8 psukim, which of course deals with Moshe's death, which is a difficult thing to understand, or Yehoshua wrote the last 8 psukim of the Torah. So we traced the Rambam's view and Rashi's view, and we spoke openly about the Shita Mikubetzes and some other views, and we saw what the Shulchan Aruch ultimately had to say in Mishnah Berurah. Of course, this comes into play in the sense that the Gemara tells us that regardless of who wrote these last 8 psukim of the Torah, we have this idea that a Yachid reads it. So we explained that a Yachid, I'm not going to go through all the different opinions, but could mean a single person who is under the age of bar mitzvah. We spoke about that. It could mean someone who is not in a minyan. That was the Rambam's view, which was the most out there view, so to say. We spoke about that it could be that these 8 psukim of the Torah have to be read separately from all the other aliyot in the Torah. We spoke about that while other aliyos can be divided into 3 psukim, this one has to stay as an 8 psukim whole. We spoke about that the Yachid actually could mean that a very important special person has to read these psukim, which is actually one of the customs that is mostly followed in our shuls today. This, of course, is dealt with on Simchat Torah. Today, I would like to sort of tight it all up together. I want to find out if really the 2 opinions, one that Moshe wrote it, and wrote it, as the Gemara says, b'dmaot, which until now we've explained as tears, how that could fit in, or how the people who say that Yehoshua wrote it, which on a logical level makes more sense considering it's about Moshe's death, how they can actually work together, and and that is basically answered by the Vilna Gaon, as we'll see, as I keep mentioning. I'm foreshadowing, but before we see that, I would like to take a look at one more opinion, and that is of the Maharal from Prague. Of course, Maharal from Prague was a great sage. Unfortunately, the Maharal is often given credit more so for the Golem, which, historically speaking, he most probably didn't even create. But he was a great sage. His shul still stands in Prague, for those who ever want to go visit the Czech Republic. Hitler did us a favor by wanting to make Prague his capital city after the Germans would defeat the rest of the world, left Prague completely intact, and as a result, we have the whole Jewish quarter of Prague still intact, which actually gets a lot of visitors from non-Jews as well, which is really rare when it comes to Jewish, communities in Europe in modern times. So, as I was mentioning, the Maharal wrote a Perush on Rashi. This is not surprising. The reason it's not surprising is, other than the Rambam, Maimonides, so we saw one of his opinions last week, Rashi has more commentaries written on Rashi than most probably any other Perush or even any other Sefer. That meaning there are hundreds of published famous ones and thousands of not published famous commentaries, running commentaries on Rashi on the Chumash. My favorite one personally is the one I'm about to show you, not the specific piece, but even though it's a nice piece, but is the Maharal from Prague, who wrote a a parish called the Gor Aryeh, which is works off the bracha that Yaakov in Parshas Vayechi gives to Shevet Yehuda, Gor Aryeh, which is what the symbol of Jerusalem is now as well. Aryeh, the Maharal's name was Rav Aryeh Leib, and that's the idea of Aryeh, and this has to do with the lion. And just before we look at it inside, I want to remind you one thing that I have not mentioned, just as a way that we have to remember. We need to keep in mind the last thing we learned in last week's shir, which is the Ramban's introduction to the Torah. The reason why this is important is because the Ramban works with the idea that Moshe Rabbeinu was mekabel the whole entire Torah from the mouth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and gave it over in such a way that it was almost it was almost understandable as compared to the way it was beforehand. Meaning that the Torah existed in some form prior to Moshe writing it down. Moshe wrote it down from the mouth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu so that we, the Jews, could have what we call today modern Torah and to learn from. So just keep that in mind. I know that wasn't so clear, but the reason why it wasn't so clear is because the truth is the Ramban wasn't so clear about it, but we're about to get a little clarity on this. Okay, let's begin. So this is the Maharal who comments on the final 8 psukim in the Rashis over there. Ela HaKadosh Baruch Hu Omer Moshe Koteb B'dama. This is the Rambam, the Maharal is bringing the quote from the from Rashi, and Rashi, of course, is quoting the Gemara in Bava Kama. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu would give over the Torah, as we just said, the Ramban mentions, and Moshe wrote it with his tears. Right? That's the quote from the Gemara, that why are these psukim different? It's because Moshe, as opposed to writing it like he did the rest of the Torah, wrote this with his tears. Right? Strange statement to say the least. Perish Aram. Lo b'dayo. He wrote it with tears, but not with ink? Could that be? So what is this whole idea of he wrote the last 8 psukim, the last 8 verses with his tears? Lateit hevdil ben hashmone psukim l'shar kol Torah. So on the simplest level, when we say Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the last 8 psukim of the Torah, authored the last 8 psukim of the Torah, and we say he wrote it with his tears, it's just to make some sort of distinction between the rest of the Torah. So here we have this idea that the Gemara brings, so that a yachid, which we just went through a bunch of the opinions that we mentioned last week on a halachic level, could read them. Right? So the whole idea why we say that a yachid could read it is because Moshe wrote this with his tears, or so it seems. Kedisa b'Perakashosun, as it's written in Perakashosun in Bava Basra Tetzvav Amav. Udvarim bilti muvanim he. And the Maharal says, if you ask me, this makes absolutely no sense. She'ech Moshe katav b'dama shelo b'dayo. How could Moshe literally write a Torah with tears as opposed to ink? Right? Moshe wrote down the Torah. The Torah sat next to the Aaron Bris Hashem. How could Moshe have written letters with tears? I mean, it's a nice drush, but how could he practically have written the Torah with his tears as opposed to ink? The Kaimalon Sefer Torah Shelo Katvu B'Tayo Psula. So the Maharal takes it one step further. He says, the Maharal lived not too long ago in Jewish terms, in the last 500 years. We know that a Sefer Torah that's not written with ink is puzzle. It's not kosher. Meaning that we have certain ink that we use to write a Sefer Torah, but the chalal, and there's certain things that's kosher, certain things that's not kosher. In certain ways you can write it that are kosher, certain ways that you can write it that aren't kosher. But the chalal, it needs to be written with ink. You can't write it with tears. In other words, tears is not an acceptable form of writing on a Sefer Torah. So he uses practical rabbinics against the Gemara. He says, what do you mean? Moshe wrote it with his tears. And he says, okay, so I know you're going to say to me, okay, because these 8 psukim are different. That's why he can write it with tears. But how could it be? Say, the cave in the Alpino, we learn now in the Gemara of Menachos, the Bika Siva B'dayo, B'shalo B'dayo, B'shalo. Again, the Gemara says, B'ferish, the Gemara itself says, B'ferish, that if Torah has to be written with ink, and if it's not in ink, anything else is possible. So I don't want to hear the argument that these 8 psukim are different, because that's not the case. Because why? Because this is the Sefer Torah. No one is denying that the last 8 psukim belong to the Torah. Everyone agrees that it belongs to the Torah. So don't tell me that the last 8 psukim are different. It has to be in ink. V'od, and I'll go one step further. Why do we need, what's the purpose of us knowing that these 8 psukim were written without ink? Is this so we can say a yochid could read it? Or in other words, why do we even need this idea that it was that the last 8 psukim were written with tears as opposed to ink? Was it so we can say that it has special halachot, as we keep talking about, that a yochid could read it? Well, again, whatever a yochid means. They know. He says, no, I don't think so. The Maharal says, Deha. Let me move up my corner. Adarabah. He says, no, on the contrary, Shinatan Talama yochid korban fresh mishum subadoma. So rather, he says it works on the converse way, which is, well, we're told that a yochid could read. And why are we told a yochid could read? Because it was written by tears. In other words, that the tears preceded the yochid, not the yochid preceded the tears. So again, the Maharal says this whole thing is strange. Chaim asks a question. Anyone who's writing me a chat, by the way, first of all, you can either write to all participants, and then everyone sees. You can write it to all attendees, and then I don't see, and you can pass notes behind my back. Or you can write it to one another, and then I also don't see, anyone else sees, but you're still writing notes behind my back, which is perfectly fine. It's the advantage of modern technology. Or you can write to all participants, in which case I see it, and everyone else sees it. Or you can just write to host and presenter, which is just me. So those are all your fun options for the day. Chaim writes, according to any opinion of writing portions of the Torah in stones, what is that considered? According to any opinions of writing portions of the Torah in stones, what is that considered? The Torah has to be written with ink. Any other Torah, save for Torah, as we know it, is puzzle. Okay. There we go. The Imkain, the Maharal finishes. Lama kol zod, lama nechtavu b'dayo. Right? What's with all this, and what about ink? Oh, to lo hava leila meimar Moshe kotab b'dama. And he says, I don't believe, basically the Maharal says, that Moshe wrote this with tears. That the actual ink was tears, or, the writing, the apparatus that he used was tears. Rather, why is it Moshe kotab b'dama? Shalashon zeh mashma nefilot maut. When the Gemara says that Moshe wrote with tears, all it means is that Moshe wrote this when he was literally crying. Havalei lomar Moshe kotab b'demaot. And it should have said Moshe kotab b'demaot. He wrote while crying, while in tears. It says in Tehillim. He says, "V'vaday perish tozen." There's some sort of mistake in terms of how the Gemara wrote it down. So how does the Maharal understand all this? Because again, the Maharal, as we keep saying, does not understand. Not that he doesn't understand Rav Shimon's position of Moshe wrote the things with Torah, and that's why we have a Yachid. He understands that there's a difference of Allah. But he says it can't be that Moshe wrote the thing with tears. This doesn't make sense. So he says what? And this is what he finishes with. Perish Moshe kosev b'dama. Moshe wrote with his tears. Shayam Moshe bocheh al misato. Moshe started crying about his death. In other words, at the end of the Torah, Moshe knew he was dying. He knew he was dying from a few parshios prior to this. And that's when all these speeches began. And Moshe, as we're told about the tzaddikim, and we're told that a few tzaddikim, didn't know, knew already before that they were going to be dead, before they were going to die. Specifically, Yaakov Avinu, and a few weeks ago, we're told that, he knew that he was going to die. So Moshe knew that he was going to die. And what happened? He started crying. The famous words we say in Shir HaMalos. That when Moshe wrote the words Vayamas Moshe, Moshe was dying. Haya boche. He started crying. In other words, Moshe knew that he was dying. So when we say that Moshe wrote the words of the Torah when he was crying, what does it mean with his tears? That he was crying. And if you understand it like this, the Maharal says, you don't have to ask the question of how could Moshe have written the words Vayamat Moshe. Why? Because he wasn't dead. He wasn't dead, but he began to die. He knew he was in the process of dying. Moshe was still alive when he wrote this. But because he was crying on his death, this was the beginning of his death. And that's the idea of Vayamas Moshe. So the idea, again, if you want to understand it back to the Gemara, is according to the Maharal, yes, Moshe wrote this in tears. So yes, the halacha could be a little, according to the Maharal, the halacha still shouldn't be different. In other words, that doesn't answer that question. But if you want to understand the question of how did Moshe write the Torah, the last Eight Sifrim Torah, which is the more important question on some level than the halacha question, then what? Moshe wrote the Torah and wrote by Vayamas Moshe because he knew he was dying. And it's not so far out to say that a tzaddik knows when he's dying. A tzaddik's very connected to the world. A tzaddik's very connected to around him. It's not surprising to him. Moshe didn't have any pain when he died. As we know, as we saw last week, either HaKadosh Baruch Hu buried him or he buried himself. It's not the way you and I know death. The Seder. So that is the opinion of the Maharal. Now, and this will sort of tie both weeks together, what we're about to look at is an unbelievable parish by the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon was, as I sent you in that Wikipedia article, was a tremendous Torah sage that lived in the 18th century. Basically, his life, I don't remember, you have the dates right in front of you, spanned most of the 18th century. And he was, in addition to being a tremendous Talmudist, he was a tremendous Kabbalist. The Vilna Gaon commented on Torah in a different way than the people of his time. Meaning, as I'm assuming that Rav Sachs has taught you at some point, the different time periods of the Jewish sages from basically Moshe Rabbeinu onwards, but more specifically from the time that the Jews returned to Israel after for the Second Temple, have had different names. So you had the Tanaim, and you had the Amoraim, and you had the Gaonim, and you had the Rishonim, and there's some others say that there's another period over there. And you had the Achronim, and today you either have the Poskim or the Rosh Yeshiva or whatever you want to call it, or some people still call it the Achronim. But the fact is that all those different groups I just named you somewhat fit into a category, not just by names, but how they commented. Meaning, to give you the simple example, Rishonim, who lived after, not to get confused, but Rishonim generally, Rishonim are people who lived basically from the 11th century to the 15th century, basically commented on the Gemara. Rashi was a Rishon, the Rambam Maimonides was a Rishon. They commented on the Gemara. The Gemara preceded them, and they commented, and they made halachic excerpts out of the Gemara, right? Achronim came after. Generally, the first Achron, who's credited to be the first Achron? So the first Achron is credited to be the Beis Yosef or Yosef Cairo, the Baal Shulchan Aruch, the person who wrote the Shulchan Aruch. For some reason, he's given, it's not for some reason, but it's an argument whether he's the last Rishon or the first Achron, but he's known as the first Achron. No one ever gave people these specific titles. What did he do? What did the Shulchan Aruch do? He commented on all the Rishonim. He commented on the Rambam, on the Rif, on the Rosh, on the Ran, etc., etc., etc. Meaning what? That they had material from the previous so-called generation, which spanned 400 or 500 years, that they commented on. And that's what modern-day halacha is almost about. We follow according to Shulchan. Now we have poskim and Rosh Yeshiva who deal with questions from the Mishnah Berurah, from Achronim, etc., etc. The Vilna Gaon, when people say he was an Achron, in other words, he lived in the times of the Achronim, he lived in the 18th century. So as I just mentioned to you, Achronim commented on Rishonim, who preceded them, who commented on people like the Rambam and people of that nature. What did the Gra do? What did the Gra is another name for the Gaon from Vilna. And the Gra stands for the Gaon Rebbe Eliyahu, which is his name. What did he do? He did something that hadn't been done in many years. He commented directly. He made his halachic decisions directly from the Gemara, from the Amoraim who lived 800-900 years before it. So that's what it means when we say that the Gra was sort of ahead of his time, or so much. So we'll get more into the Gra later, and another historical piece of data later on when we finish, because it'll tie in what I'm going to show you after. But let's just see what he has to say about this. So he has many svarim. One of them is called the Kol Eliyahu, which comments on Parshat HaShavua, and it says as follows: the Gemara in Maseches Bava Basra. The Gemara in Maseches Bava Basra, Tanya, taught in the Brisa. Command the Amar Shmona Pesukim Shebetorah YEHOSHUA Katzvan. That there's an opinion that says that the last 8 Pesukim of the Torah Yehoshua wrote, the Tanya Vayamash Moshe, because we're taught that Moshe died over there, and therefore, if Moshe died, Yehoshua must have written. After Moshe Chai V'Katzav Vayamash Moshe, because how could it be that Moshe was alive and he would write Moshe died there, right? So we just saw one way that you could understand that, but the Gra asked the question. The Gra lived after the Maharal, by the way. Ella Ad Kan Kasav Moshe. Rather, Moshe wrote all the Torah until here. The Kamela Kasav Yeshua, Divrei of Yeshua. So this is straight from the Gemara. From here in the words. Yeshua wrote, and these are the words of Rabbi Yeshua. Amar layer of Shimon. Rav Shimon said on this idea, Efshar Sefer Torah Chas or Osa Chas. Is it possible that we could have a Sefer Torah that's missing a letter? What's the question again? In the previous Parshas Vayelech, Moshe Rabbeinu says, take Sefer Torah Zeh, take this Sefer Torah, the keyword Zeh, meaning what? This whole entire Sefer Torah, and put it next to the Aron Hashem, meaning that Moshe said, here's my Torah that I just read in the 5 books of Moses, take it. So the Rav Shimon's question is, how could it be that Moshe is telling them to take this Sefer Torah if he didn't write it? Ela ad kana Kadosh Baruch Hu omer, o Moshe omer v'kosev. So what is the Gemara answer? Rather, until this point of the Torah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu would orally transmit the Torah. Moshe would then repeat it, and then, or would teach it, and then he would write it down. Right? And we spoke about last week what this could have meant. This is most probably because of confirmation, to make sure that he learned it correctly, also so that he taught it correctly, so there was some sort of aid, some sort of testimony. And then he says, but these last psukim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Omer, these last 8 psukim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Moshe, Moshe kotev b'dama, and Moshe wrote it with his tears. Right? That statement again. Meaning that instead of Moshe Rabbeinu repeating it or teaching it and writing it down, he didn't do that with these last 8 psukim, but he wrote it with his tears. Adshan. So here we go. And this is awesome. And this is why he's the Gaon. Gaon means like brilliant person and like sage and wise and everything positive to say, Akusha negles l'kol ha'ech teres Rav Shimon kushas to Rav Yeshua. The Ka'amar Efshar Moshe Chai v'Kasav Vayamash Moshe the Mechzek Shiyikrachas Yishalom. Now what does he say? That everyone understands Rabbi Shimon's question to Rabbi Yeshua. That how could it be that Moshe was alive, the Kasav Vayamash Moshe Sham, right? And everyone understands this idea that it's difficult to understand that Moshe was alive and he wrote Vayamash Moshe. Because what? If Moshe was alive and he wrote I'm dead, then Moshe's a liar. Right? I'm not saying those words. The Gra says these words. Shikr Chasham, he's a shakran. Umati Shaya Kosev B'dama. So, in other words, that's the question. That's the question. Is Moshe Rabbeinu a liar? That he's alive and he's writing, I'm dead? Or I'm about to tell you what takes place in the future? Now, we spoke about last week a little bit, that it's not to say that prophecy, you won't know these things in prophecy. But the Torah wasn't written on prophecy about the future. The Torah was written, as we saw in the introduction to the Ramban, was written in stages. Nothing was written before it took place. Either it was written, parts of it after Har Sinai, parts of it later on in the desert, parts of it in the 40 years, or perhaps all of it was written in the 40th year. But regardless, it wasn't written in advance. So what's the answer that Rabbi Shimon gives that it was written in tears? What does that mean? Dilechora Tiken Rashi Zal Hakusha Ki Kol Torah Mar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kol Tevat LeMoshe V'Hu Chozer V'Amar Kol Tevat Kadei Shelo Yiteh. So this actually answers Chaim's question from last week. Chaim wanted to know, did HaKadosh Baruch Hu read the whole entire Torah to Moshe word by word or letter by letter? So the Gra learns from Rashi, and Rashi does not say this inside in terms of this exact word. The Gra says that according to Rashi, you can understand that HaKadosh Baruch Hu read Kol Teva Moshe. Every single little thing in the Torah he read to Moshe. And Moshe Chozer B'Omer Kol Teva. Moshe would repeat to HaKadosh Baruch Hu every little thing he said. Kadei Shelo Yiteh. In order so that he would not make a mistake, so he knew that he understood what HaKadosh Baruch Hu said. And afterwards he wrote it down. And he did this until Vayam Hashem Moshe. We just saw this Rashi, and this is the Rashi that the Maharal was commenting on. But from this point on, where the Moshe didn't write anything, because how could we understand this based on this? Because if Moshe would have repeated it to Bnei Yisrael, I'm dead, then he's a shakran, because he wasn't dead yet. So therefore, he wrote it without saying it, because if he would have wrote it and not saying it, on some level he's not a liar. Now, I don't like this answer, and neither does the Gra. In other words, it's a weak answer. It's like, oh, because he taught everything orally to Bnei Yisrael and repeated it, so by saying that he didn't repeat it or orally say it here, it means that we escaped the question that Moshe was a liar, because he never really lied about it, because he never really said it. But the Gra says it's still a kasha. I don't like it. Even if he didn't say it at all to Bnei Yisrael, even if he didn't repeat it to Bnei Yisrael, he should write it down. In other words, he can write, just by the fact that he writes it down, that makes him not a liar, because he wrote it down and not said it. Right? Good question. That's his thumb. And then the Gra asks a further question. Of course, below Khan, Navi, Yisrael, Moshe. We know Moshe is the greatest prophet of all time. Moshe is the greatest human being on some level, on all levels of all time. So what? To the greatest human being that ever faced this earth, with Tov, Sheker, Chatzshama, Fil, B'Lo, Amira, we could say, oh, he wrote it down? He wrote it down, so that means he's not a liar because he didn't say it? No. So the Gra says, you might think that answers your question by saying that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't say it, but he wrote it, so therefore he's allowed to do it, and therefore he's not a liar. The Gra says, first of all, it's a weak answer. Second of all, look who we're dealing with. We're dealing with Moshe Rabbeinu. We're not dealing with Joe Schmo. So it can't be. Or I just don't like it. So the Gra continues. The Imkain. So I still think this, even if this is all the case, there's still a question. There's still a kasha on Rav Shimon. How could you, Rabbi Shimon, answer and actually say that Moshe wrote it with his tears? In other words, it doesn't fit. You want to get out of it? You want to say that he wrote it with his tears because it means that he didn't have to say it? No. In other words, at this point, it looks like the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, is leaning towards the explanation that Rabbi Yeshua said. That what? That Yeshua Amar. That Yeshua wrote it. V'ot kasha. And he says, I have another question, the Gra says. Eich Amar Rav Yehuda shemikam ve'elach kasav Yehoshua v'lo chashav klal ekushas Rav Shimon. He says, how could Rabbi Yeshua made the statement that Yehoshua ben Nun wrote the end of the Torah and never thought about the question of Rabbi Shimon? What's the question of Rabbi Shimon? Which is, how could we have any part of the Sefer Torah not written by Moshe Rabbeinu? These are the 5 books of Moshe. Did Rabbi Yeshua not think about that? Did Rabbi Yeshua not know that Moshe said in the previous parsha, the Sefer Torah, take this Sefer Torah, the Sefer Torah I wrote? How could he just so easily say that Yeshua wrote it? So the Gra, and this is what I was explaining to you in my introduction to the Gra, isn't commenting on Gemara, on the Rambam and what a Yachid means, etc., and what the Shulchan Aruch says, etc., etc. He's asking right on the Gemara. I have a question for you, people who write the Gemara. What are you talking about? You know, Moshe wrote with his tears, or Rav Yeshua wrote it down. How could it be that Yeshua wrote it down if that's the case? Ayita Ken, so he says, I'm sorry for the background noise of the baby. Ayita Ken, sheyichtov Torah Hashem, afiru osachat shelo yada Moshe, alo mikrem lo davar kasuv, zichru Torah Moshe adei, u'shnei adei shel Rabbi Yehoshua hem akasha havana me'od. So he says as follows, the Gra, and this is where it really starts getting unbelievable. He says, if you're going to claim that the Torah of Hashem, even one letter, was written with not by Moshe Rabbeinu, the whole entire thing is you can't listen to anything in the Torah, right? And he brings a pasuk, Zichru Torah Moshe. We know it's called the Torah of Moshe. So he says, yet he doesn't like Rav Shimon's answer either about the Demaot, about the tears. So he says, Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabbi Shimon, came a kasha of Namod. Really, the two opinions of Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Shimon, one that Yehoshua wrote and one that Moshe wrote with tears, are really something that's very easy to understand. Or once you understand them, it'll all make sense. And I tell you, you will, even before we're about to see it. How the Gra explains it. So he says as follows. We already know there's a different halachos about when writing something is like dibur, that when you write something it has the same halachot of saying something. So I still think it's a question of Reb Shimon. So he says, in reality, what you have to say is that there really is no argument between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehoshua in the Gemara, which is a wild statement. What do you mean there's no argument? What do you mean they don't disagree? One says Moshe read it, one says Yehoshua wrote it. One says Moshe wrote it with tears, one says Yehoshua wrote it. What do you mean there's no argument? And this is how the Gra explains it. Anon yesh lefarish ki shneim divrei Elokim chayim. Two of them have the ways of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and their words of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of the Moraim, are living. Umar Amar Chada v'lo pligi. And really, there's one says one thing, and the other one says another thing, but there's no argument. Ki l'chora kasha b'divrei Gemara, ma mekasha achat ha'psukim ha'achronim she'utar, keach nechtavu Moshe adayin chai. He says, because the question still stands. How is it that Moshe wrote the last 8 psukim of the Torah if he was alive? In other words, by answering that Moshe wrote it with his tears, that doesn't answer the question, right? It doesn't answer the question that Moshe that Moshe wrote that he was dead, says the Gaon. So you still have the question of how did Moshe write the last 8 psukim of the Torah if he was alive? Halo kol Torah kula ita nechtava alpayim shana kodemet riyasol. So the Gra says as follows, and he got this from the Ramban, who got this from the Sifrei, the books of the Kabbalah. Don't we know that the whole entire Torah was written 2,000 years prior to the creation of the world? You can all look at me like, what does that mean? So he says, Im kain lo haya adayin hashamayim ha'aretz kol asher ba. And therefore, the beginning of the Torah, when there was no heavens and earth, and it says, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'ha'aretz, right? Hashem created the heavens and the earths in the beginning. This all existed in the Torah before that ever happened. The Dor Mabul and the generation of the flood, the Dor Flagah and the generation in Bavel that dealt with the mixed up languages, the Yetzias from Mitzrayim, the Domaim, and about Yetzias from Mitzrayim leaving Egypt and everything that took place. It all existed 2,000 years before the Torah, the world was ever created. How could that be? How could the Torah have been written before any of this took place? It's silly. I don't want to say it's silly, but no, it's a good question. How could the Torah write about Yetzias Mitzrayim before thousands of years before Yetzias Mitzrayim took place? So this is what he says. Namnam zos yadua ki kol Torah shmosav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And where did he get this from? As I said, he got this from the Ramban, who got this from the Kabbalah. Now, what? As we saw last week, the whole entire Torah is actually just multiple names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'hainu al yidei tzirufim shel otiyos v'tevos, and what we read them based on different ways of, I'll get back to this in a second, but we sort of figure out the puzzle of the letters. We read it Bereshit bara Elokim, but we saw last week in the Ramban how he gave the example how you can read that differently than Bereshit bara Elokim, right? So he says that we sort of just fix up the puzzles. That before the world was created, the Torah was just, as the Ramban writes, Eish Shachor Eish Lavan. It was black fire and white fire. It was all one long strip of letters that was all had to do with deep Kabbalistic meanings. It all had to do with the names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Below Isan Nikras K'mo Akshav. And we didn't. And if you read the Torah 2,000 years before the existence of the world, you would not. It's not the same Torah as today. The letters are exactly the same. The order of the letters are exactly the same. But how we see the words and how the prakim are divided up, that wasn't the same. Raka Pishmo Sav Shal Kadosh Baruch Hu. It was only written in a way that you can understand the names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But after Hashem created the world, Torah Yisrael, and gave the Torah to Yisrael, and He gave us the mitzvahs that we have to do in certain places and certain times. The Torah then came around and explained very well how it is that we should do these mitzvahs. The Chalach Kol Torah Latevas Otios L'Galus L'Farish is called Torah Azos, and the Torah was written in a form that you and I know it now, right? Elish Mos Bnei Yisrael Be'im Mitzrayim, Vayikach Yisrael Choseh and Moshe. This week's parsha. That's the way we see it now, and that only took place, and we're told that they get to wear on a four-corner garment tzitzit. That's only written now after the world was created, after the Torah was given to Bnei Israel. The Torah existed well before this, but how we see the Torah now, that only took place after the Torah was given to Am Yisrael. It's a deep, deep idea. The Sodas HaTorah Pitzurfim Nisnu Liyodei, and we were given this, and this is how the Torah is created. The Torah can be understood in so many ways. That the depths, the secrets of the Torah were now given to us in our Torah form based on how we see the letters and how we see the words right now. Now, why this is such an idea, and the Ramban mentions, this is why you understand that if one letter of the Torah is missing, it's puzzle. Why? Because it's really just all the long name of Hashem. And we have it written out in our way, but in reality, it's just a long word of Hashem. Masha'ein, so he concludes as follows. Masha'ein modi'im el l'chacham me'vim daso, right? And he says how this was given and how this was divided up and how sort of this long name of Hashem was sort of like deciphered. Even a chacham, it's difficult for him to actually comprehend, yet alone do it. And now mitaretz divrei Gemara. And he says, the Gemara says, and with this explanation, you're about to understand what the Gemara said. Ki kavanas Rabbi Shimon. Because Rabbi Shimon, when he said, when he asked the question, how could it be that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't write the Torah? Because how could a Sefer Torah be missing even one letter? He was writing, how could a Sefer Torah not be written by Moshe Rabbeinu? How could it be? In other words, everyone else understands these words as Sefer Torah. How could Moshe have not written every letter of the Torah? He says, no, Rabbi Shimon wasn't asking that question. He was writing, the Sefer Torah that we have is the real Sefer Torah. And it could be that Yehoshua wrote it, according to this opinion by the Gra, by Rabbi Shimon. But he says, what? It can't be that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote that he was dead, because Moshe Rabbeinu would never write that. So the Gra is holding by this idea that what? That Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't have lied, which means he couldn't have wrote that he was dead, but yet we also say that the Gra is saying that what? That the Sefer Torah couldn't be missing one letter. So how does he understand this? He says as follows. L'kachu omer ad kan HaKadosh Baruch Hu kasav, l'kachu omer ad kan HaKadosh Baruch Hu omer, Moshe omer v'koseh. This is the answer. He says, and only the Gra can come up with something like this. He says what? That's why the Gemara Rashi brings and says that until now HaKadosh Baruch Hu said everything, and Moshe said it and wrote it. And from this point forward, only HaKadosh Baruch Hu said it, and Moshe wrote it, and he never said it. Why? Rotzelomar Shamar Moshe Kol Teva B'Teva Kasher Hi Ketuva B'Yadeinu B'Gilai Mitzvos. Moshe Rabbeinu would hear the Torah from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? And he'd write it down, and he'd write, as we just spoke about, he'd write, this is a mitzvah. You have to keep kosher. You have to keep Shabbos. You have to keep the laws of Nida, right? And it was the Torah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu would say the Torah, and Moshe turned it. Moshe deciphered the puzzle, right? And he turned it into our Torah today. And that's why he would say it over, to make sure he got it right.
But from this point forward, when you reach the last 8 psukim of the Torah, Lo haya yachol l'chtav b'giloi v'yam Hashem Moshe. He wasn't able to understand the puzzle of the Kabbalistic idea of these long letters just written. He wasn't able to decipher it, and he wasn't able to write the words Vayam Hashem Moshe. Why? Because if he would have written that, or if he would have understood that, he would have been a liar. The Mechse kashikra, he would have been a liar if he would have written that. The Gam lo haya yachol l'gmor al yedei Yehoshua. But we also, so what does he say? Just to review, HaKadosh Baruch Hu had a Torah. The Torah existed 2,000 years before the creation. Moshe Rabbeinu came around. HaKadosh Baruch Hu would read him out the letters. Moshe, in a way that no other human being in the history of the world, would take the Sefer Torah and turn it, they take this long name of Hashem and turn it into the mitzvahs that he was taught by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that Bnei Yisrael had to have. He turned it into the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim that we're reading right now in the Torah, or about what took place in the Torah about Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. That all existed, but Moshe just turned it into things. But when Moshe got to the last 8 psukim of the Torah, he was no longer able to do this. He couldn't. He wasn't capable. Why? Not most probably because he wasn't intellectually capable. That's suddenly the last 8 psukim. Because if he would have been able to do this, if he would have been able to, he would have been a liar. And then the question of Yehoshua stands, which is what? How could Moshe have written that he was dead when he's not dead? So what is he saying? Yes, Rav Shimon's question to Rav Yehoshua stands. How could the whole entire Sefer Torah have been written missing one letter? It couldn't have been. Moshe wrote down every single letter. V'gam lo haya yachol l'gmor al yedei Yehoshua. And he says, and also, it can't be that Yehoshua finished the Sefer Torah without Moshe. Ki efshar Sefer Torah chaseros echad v'kach hu omer shaya koteh b'damo. So he says, what? Yehoshua couldn't have written down because could the Sefer Torah be missing even one letter? So he says, therefore, it must be that Moshe wrote it down with his tears. So what does this mean that Moshe wrote it down with his tears? V'apershu milatech v'damech v'tzelomar midomea v'arvo otiyos. So this is how he explains it. These are the words. For those of you who know the halachas of the laws of Trumos and Maasros, there's something called Demai. Daled Mem Aleph. Demai, or Daled Mem, there's Mishnayos on it. Demai, I'm sorry for writing on too long, so I guess that makes it my own puzzle. Demai is when you don't know when you separate, right? We separate Trumos and Maasros for the Kohanim, for the Leviim, for the poor people, for the Beis Hamikdash, for, right? We separate Trumos and Maasros in Eretz Yisrael. We do these mitzvahs still. At least on the Rabbanan level, but we still do it. But when you don't know whether what you separated is Truma, meaning when you separate something for Truma, it becomes Hekdesh, it becomes Kadosh, because it belongs to the Beis Hamikdash or to the Kohanim, etc., etc. So when you don't know whether you separated it for the Beis Hamikdash or whether God mixed them with your chol, with your regular stuff, with your regular produce, it's called demai. It's mixed up. It's mixed up. That's what the word demai means, mixed up. So what does the Gra say? He says, when Rabbi Shimon says that Moshe wrote the words Demaot, it doesn't mean that he wrote it with his tears, but what? He wrote Demai is with it means that he wrote it because he wrote it mixed up. He wasn't able to figure it out. So he says, he wrote that when Rabbi Shimon says, how could it be that the Torah is missing a filu ot echad, one letter, meaning that Moshe didn't write it, and then he answers that Moshe wrote it with his tears, and we have all these questions, what does that mean, Moshe wrote it with his tears? He says, no, it's not that Moshe wrote it with his tears. Moshe wrote it mixed up. What does it mean he wrote it mixed up? From this point onwards, these last 8 psukim of the Torah, Moshe wrote them down the same way they were premortally. He wrote them down the same way they were the Otiyot of Hashem, because these existed already. And Moshe put them down in the Torah. And Moshe wrote the whole entire Torah down. Until now, it was in Shamayim. Moshe took it, and when he got to these last 8 psukim, he was mixed up. He couldn't figure out what it was saying. He couldn't write down Vayamas Moshe. Moshe died. So what did he do, according to the Gra? He wrote it, and the Gra gets this from the Gemara, that Moshe wrote a bidmaot in tears. No! Not tears. He wrote a bidama, mixed up. he kept the letters in the mixed-up form, or we call mixed-up, the shemos, the otios of Hashem, and he put them down. V'lo haya nikra klav vayam Hashem Moshe. And it didn't write down the words vayam Hashem Moshe. Moshe died over there. Rak tevot acharot. It wrote other words and other letters, apiso dos Torah, based on deep mystical meanings of the Torah. And this is how he understands it. La'achar misaso. So that answers the question, right? Every letter of the Torah was written by Moshe. That's Rabbi Shimon's question. Yes, you're right, but he wrote the last ones mixed up. So, what about Yehoshua? How could Rabbi Yehoshua not know this, that Moshe wrote the whole entire Torah? Why would he dare say that Yehoshua ben Nun wrote the end of the Torah? So this is why the Gra says there's no question. La'achar misaso. After Moshe Rabbeinu died and had written down all these words of the Torah based on how they were premortally in this mixed-up form, Katvam Yehoshua k'fi shenitan lo reshus legalos et Torah. Yehoshua wrote it down, took these 8 psukim and turned them around and turned it just like Moshe Rabbeinu did the rest of the Torah, and he did it based on how the Torah played itself out. Meaning what? He then wrote down by Yamash Moshe, the Lo Kam Navi Yisrael Kam Moshe. He wrote down those last 8 psukim that Moshe wrote down. Yehoshua de-scrambled and wrote it down. And what does this teach us? This teaches us 2 things. First of all, it teaches us that there's no machlokas here according to the Torah, and that there's no machlokas even according to the Gemara. But it also teaches us a lesson in Torah and how Torah turned from Torah Shebachtav to Torah She-Baal Peh. Right? There's certain things that are understood at certain generations that you guys, I know, have learned Introduction to the Rambam. I think I'm not sure if you're up to this, but the famous story, of Moshe sitting in the back of the basement, and Moshe sitting in Shemayim, and he sees Rabbi Akiva and his students learning, and he sees Rabbi Akiva darshaning out the crowns of the letters of the Torah. So Moshe Rabbeinu says to Kadosh Baruch Hu, Moshe Rabbeinu says to Kadosh Baruch Hu, what's this Rabbi Akiva guy doing? And so Kadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe, I'll take you, and I'll send you, and I'll have you sit in the back of his classroom. So Moshe Rabbeinu goes, and he sits in the back of Rabbi Akiva's classroom, and there's darshaning out the different crowns on top of the letters, and one of the students raised their hands, and they say to Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Akiva, where did you get this? And Moshe's sitting in the back of the classroom, and also remember why Moshe is there. And Rabbi Akiva says, it's halacha from Moshe Sinai. It's halacha, it's law from Moshe Sinai. And that's how the Gemara ends. Well, how is this done? How do we understand this? So you can understand this from this story. All the Torah came from the Piv Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from the mouth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu put everything down. And as the Gemara explains, he might have put it down like this, his last 8 psukim of the Torah, and Yehoshua had to come by and de-scramble it. Why? Because Moshe wasn't able yet. Moshe wasn't capable yet. And that's what the Torah She-Baal Peh is. Moshe received everything there was to know about the Torah at the time and gave us the tools to what the future generations, what the future Rabbanim, what the Balei Gemara and the Balei Mishnayos and the Balei Tosos and Rishonim and Acharonim, etc., etc. It was all there. It's all there for us, to the point where Moshe didn't know how to darshan out the crowns of the letter, but Rabbi Akiva did. Why? Because Moshe put the crowns of the Torah there. And that's how Torah works. And that's why when Rabbanim in our days have to make certain halachic decisions, and they can't turn back to the Gemara to answer about whether we can look at a certain thing on the internet or not, because the Gemara didn't have it. But the Torah has the tools to answer all the questions. It's just a matter of making the limud in the Torah. And that's how Torah works. And that's the Torah, and that's how the Gemara finished. There's no argument here. They're not arguments as to the validity of the Torah. He be'emes kasvan Moshe. Because in reality, Moshe wrote the Torah, and everyone knows Moshe wrote the Torah. And that's why the Rambam was saying, V'lo chasar fi'u osachas. And there's not missing even one letter. Raki ashmona psukim elu, lo yechol chtov. Just these last 8 psukim, he could not write it to a nigla. He couldn't write it in the way that we could understand it, in the nigla, Vayamas Moshe. Ukafi kasiyat tzurufun. He wrote it in this decoded, scrambled way. V'zel b'dama. And that's what it means when the Gemara says that he wrote it in tears. Ibdama, Daled Mem Ayin. Not that he wrote it in tears, but he wrote it in a mixed up form. Yeshua Kasvan Kafia Nigla. And Yeshua wrote it afterwards. Moshe died, de-scrambled it, and that's how Rabbi Yeshua explains it. Yeshua wrote it. Ushneim maskimim l'das echad. And the Quran says they really agree. It's just one's just explaining that Yeshua wrote it, and the other one's explaining that Moshe wrote the end. The Yeshua wrote it in the way we understand. The other one's explaining that Moshe wrote it with tears. Ki, as he finishes off, and we'll finish with this. Ki mechtavu ayidei shneim. Really, both of them had a part in writing it. Moshe and Moshe wrote down the actual letters and the deep secrets. Ayidei Yehoshua and Yeshua wrote it the way we see it now. Kasher yiksuv biyadenu over the as it's written with our biyadenu. Just a nice little thing. I see we're out of time. But there's something I came across, and let me just see if the Chaim says, they don't provide any way of forming the letters, the last 8 verses. No, we don't know them. I mean, I don't know. Actually, I don't know, Chaim. The truth is, I have no idea. I'm not a Mikubah, so I don't know if the Sifrei Kabbalah has it in the right way. I don't know the answer. But I do want to tell you something very interesting. And this is why I sort of sent you the introduction to the Gemara. And I think now we all see what kind of mind the Vilna Gaon had, which is as follows. The Vilna Gaon is very well known for being a misnagid. He was the person who was against Hasidism when it came out. He was at the same time, and he was against the Baal Shem Tov, who was the first Chassid. To make a very, very simplistic, difficult argument very short, Hasidim believed in tefillah and in prayer and in Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha, serving Hashem with simcha, as a way of the primary service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for all men. While until that point in history, there was some idea that Torah scholarly was really the only true way to ultimately serve Hashem. I'm really making that oversimplified, and it's not really the case, but just for the purpose of what I'm about to say. Anyways, Vilna Gaon was the main person against Hasidism, and he put the Hasidism, as you'll see in the Wikipedia article, in Cherem. He excommunicated them, etc., etc. The Baal Shem Tov, who was the founder of Hasidim and a great person, and the Gro is a great person, something very interesting that happened. We know that Sukkot is Man Simchasenu. Sukkot is, the Torah tells us, it's the time of joy, of happiness. Anyone who's been in Eretz Yisrael, I hope in Chutz La'aretz also, but in Eretz Yisrael it's really clear. It's a very happy time, Sukkot. And Shavuos is Man Matan Torah Tedu. And Shavuos, one of the other third of the Regalim, is the time that Torah was given. So just as an interesting point, the Gra, who was the proponent of Misnagdim, which was Torah scholar, died on Sukkot. Man Simchasenu, which was, the Hasidic idea. And the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidim, died on Shavuos, Man Matan Torah Tedu. Why am I saying this? Because one of the things that's so interesting, and it's sort of found this way in Eretz Yisrael now also, or sometimes it's viewed upon negatively, unfortunately, is that in reality all the Torah is one. And everything that everyone always says is one. And it's all Hashem, and it's all away from Hashem. And even if different people, and this is something that's so great about Rabbi Bravender, the person who is responsible for WebYeshiva, there's no right or wrong derech. Meaning, everyone should believe in Hashem and do the mitzvahs of Hashem, etc. But the point is, like, if you decide to do it, I'm talking all according to how not whether you're shomer mitzvahs or not whether you keep the commandments or not, but however you decide to serve Hashem within the boundaries of the laws of the Torah, it's all emes if you're doing it al pi Torah. And why is that important? Because even though the Vilna Gaon and the Baal Shem Tov were enemies, or so it seems, and they lived at the same time, and they definitely didn't have the access to each other's Torah, the same exact Torah that I just read to you, the Baal Shem Tov writes right here. And he writes in a few less lines, and he doesn't explain it in the same exact way that the Gra does. He's going to say that there's no machlokas, there's no argument between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shua. But he explains this idea that what? That Moshe wrote it hamidameh. Moshe wrote it mixed up. And then also that Zet Siru Pimacharim, and he wrote it in different letters. What does this come to show you? I mean, it's interesting to note to see everything comes from the same place. Everyone, even though they try to serve Hashem in different ways, different dirachim, it's all about serving Hashem. Anyways, I hope Baruch Hashem, we got to finish the hour. I really enjoyed teaching the shir the last 2 weeks. I hope I was successful in being able to give over to you what it was Rabbi Sachs is trying to do this month. I wish you a Shabbat Shalom from Yerushalayim. I'm not in Yerushalayim, what am I talking about? Shabbat Shalom from Neve Daniel. I'm in Yerushalayim during the day. And Shabbat Shalom, and I hope all is well. And I hope to come in contact with you all in the future in other shirim and WebYeshiva. All the best.